Good morning. When Pia asked if I would like to contribute to this, and I didn't spell check it, so I do hope it's correct, she asked if I could talk about some of the models and approaches we have in the school, and also some reflections by me. So I thought I would break it into two things. One is going to be on models of submission and an examination that are around and how we engage them in the School of Media and Com, and observations I have of examinations, including when I am the examiner. And it's quite topical because I am right in the middle of writing a report for a PhD that I'm just finishing examining from another Australian university. So the ideas of what I'm looking for, but also what the guidelines are, is actually quite important, because every university has its own expectations and models of examination. And so when you end up at the point where you're starting to do examinations, each university gives you a guideline as to what they expect. And the one I'm examining for at the moment actually has a tick the box that you have to go through to show what it is, but also very clear about what you should be looking at. It's very instrumental kind of examination, then with a report that goes with it. One other university I examined for this year also had a rule that I had to write at least 3 pages of comments or they wouldn't pay me. So they didn't say it had to be anything to do with the actual work. I thought I could just write something, but there you go. So models of submission and examination. And to explain, the School of Media and Communication, are any of you from Media and Com? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Craig, of course. How many of you are in creative writing? 1. Only 1. Okay. All right. Well, one of the things about in Media and Com is we're a particularly large school and we're a particularly diverse school. We have 17 different professions or disciplines that are clustered in different ways. So we have people who do hard quant kind of PhDs, we have people who do social science, ethnography PhDs, we have people who do sort of experiential digital art, we have people who do applied design. It's a big mixture. So hence we have 3 different kinds of models of submission. The first one is the exhibition, dissertation, presentation. That's what A&D would call the tripartite model. And it's kind of they are the 3 requirements that we can say that the university is looking for. They are unweighted, unlike the PhD I'm examining at the moment, where the practice is 40% and the text is 60%. So, and that's one of the things that can be a little bit confusing for examiners, because we see them as being 3 parts of a whole. We also have those who do dissertation, disseminated artefact and presentation, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we have some people who just do a dissertation and disseminated artefact. By disseminated artefact, I mean we send it out and there is no presentation, where this one can have a presentation. So I'll explain it. So the first one is where there's an exhibition, and that exhibition may be project documentation. It might be another kind of articulation of the findings of the research. It takes many forms. It's not often an exhibition in the way that you would see more in art or architecture and design, because of the nature of the practices in the school. Some of those who do games, they might have an installation. We're starting to get some more digital environmental stuff, which it will move more into that space. But we have a large number of communication design people doing PhDs, and they don't like doing exhibitions, oddly. So it's often a presentation of work. But we have had one fantastic examination at the end of last year by an Indigenous PhD student who is also a musician, and she performed and sang a lot of her actual findings, because it was all about reclaiming the Yora, she's a Yora language, and so she would sing pieces, and she's also quite well known as a singer, and so there was sort of this interesting dimension of how she performed her discovery of language, and that was her exhibition and project documentation partly. with her presentation, the two things became one. And that also happens a bit. In the second version, where we have dissertation, artefact and disseminated artefact and presentation, this tends to happen with time-based works because we do have a lot of time-based media people in the school. So if people are making films or documentaries or short films or audio, text-based works, they're not works to having a screening as part of an examination isn't always feasible, and it allows the examiners to watch the work prior to attending the presentation. And then the students often then go back into elements of that as they go through. And that really replaces the exhibition component. And it's one of the things to think about with time-based work, especially if somebody's made an hour and a half long film or a documentary. You know, it's a challenging thing, and that's another thing I'll talk about in a moment. And then the dissertation and disseminated artefacts, that tends to happen with the text-based creative practice. So the people in creative writing might send out the novel or the creative writing or the suite of poetry or whatever it is with a dissertation. And that's kind of the norm in a lot of creative practice, creative writing doctoral projects, is that they send them out as a two-part volume and they get examined in the way that a thesis would do. There seems to be a little bit more move into doing presentation as well, particularly because novelists or writers do a lot of book fair, like they talk about their practice a lot, and one of the arguments for or against it was that they can't speak because the work speaks for itself, but it depends on what you think the role of the presentation is. This is a colleague of mine who did his PhD with me, Leo Berkeley. Leo did his PhD a couple of years ago now, and he made a 90-minute documentary as part, or film as part of his work. And so it was an experimental piece we had to actually then send that out to the examiners in advance. And what is interesting is if you go to his website, you can actually see on that site you can download the entire submission, the creative work that was submission. You can also download the dissertation. But when he did his presentation, and one of his examiners was actually in Sydney, he was unable to fly down on the day, we then in the presentation selected out moments from the bigger film that were actually really important to the key things he was saying that he had discovered in his PhD. So he actually went in and highlighted moments and didn't rely on the full narrative to be the only way of viewing the work. Because one of the challenges with a time-based piece like that is that you can evaluate it just on whether or not you like the film. And that's actually not what it's about. In the same way you can evaluate a creative writing piece as like, I like the novel. The novel is exploring ideas that we're wanting to see how they've been unpacked. In a film work, it's the same. In the same way it is in design work or others. So we used it by going in, looking at particular moments, scenes, or concepts that he was doing. And in the dissertation, where he is actually referencing other film works, he would put the two together. So we were actually bringing out, citing film to film. And we're using the digital platform in order to be able to look at how do you cite a film within a film, and how do you use that to critique your argument rather than using a text that's talking about the thing that you're looking at. And that's one of the really interesting spaces now that things like blogs and digital platforms can allow students to do in the course of the research, but also to create a resource that they can either cite as part of their part of the dissertation work, or in the way that Ruben Stanton did in his PhD, where he actually, he had the challenging thing. He was a practice-based PhD within a funded ARC on a scholarship. So he was an experienced practitioner who came in onto a research grant, but was there as a PhD student who had a prime role in helping to build the Living Archive, which is a digital archive of Circus Oz footage. But he was one of a research team of 7. There were 2 PhD students. The other one came from computer science. But he was also doing his own doctoral inquiry into the concepts in the actual submission. So he couldn't present the Living Archive as his PhD outcome. And we actually had to be very clear when we were writing his dissertation about what was his, what was the team's, and what was the unknown space of conversation. So something emerged through conversation, couldn't say whose idea it was, things that we decided and things that I did. And so he kept a blog throughout his PhD blog where he wrote his ideas, documented what he was doing, put up the elements that were particularly his line of inquiry into that project, because all the researchers had a line of inquiry, so he as a PhD student had a line of inquiry. And so then we documented what that was, and that was his contribution. So he did the standard 3-part examination, but it was as a funded PhD, which is not quite so common, but it was good. But what we did in his dissertation and in his project work is we referred to the work that was in the blog. What the examiners noted was that the blog was actually the primary side of his practice, and it was actually more interesting than the Living Archive, was what one of them said, in terms of thinking through the project. So this idea of building a portal where you put your practice as you're working through, that can be private, you don't have to make it open to the public, but but using that and citing that into your dissertation. So doing some of your writing in small bite-sized bits, collecting your resources, doing some of your critique, if you work in a digital way, can be very effective. And so we've had a number of students, especially in media, digital documentary, who've been doing this kind of work, and that's been the feedback from the examiners, that it's a very dynamic way to engage with the concepts. So observations. With one of the things that I have a few bugbears. One of the things with multiform submissions, which is I'm calling anything but a standard thesis, each part must have a reason and add to the overall proposition of the research. That's why it's good to think about it now, because whatever you collect now you can use. But also to think about how it works as a whole, because we don't weight them. It doesn't matter if you do any of those 3 models of submission, they all make up a whole as far an RMIT degree. So the exhibition, to my mind, the exhibition or the artefact evidences is evidence of the research. It's through the practices that you can see the concepts, the ideas being explored and how they manifest. The dissertation positions the research into the field and articulates the discovery and the contribution. Right? So I've got things that are the evidence. This is putting it into the bigger part of the field of why this is doctoral, what my contribution is. And then the presentation is evidence of the researcher transformed, and as a result of undertaking the research. And that's why I am a pain about the importance of this component, but I also think thesis students should do this too, because everywhere else in the world you do, except for Australia and New Zealand. And it's purely history and tyranny of distance, is why we don't. So this is one of the things that's interesting, because it is in the RMIT guidelines to the examiners. Is there evidence of a contribution to practice, a contribution to the field, a contribution to practice or a change in practice through having done this? And so each part shouldn't just repeat the other. That is extraordinarily painful for an examiner. They should complement each other. So one is the practice, one positions the practice, the other is the evidence of the practitioner who performed and engages in that practice. And so it's really important that they come together and they complement each other. And it has to align to what the examiners are asked to look for. So, because I'm the only people at the very end that really matter are the two people marking your work. As there comes a point where that's what we're working towards. We'd like to contribute to the bigger field and the bigger discourse. Two people are going to bring this process to a close for you, plus you and your supervisors. So my tips are, be kind to your examiners. I'm not feeling very loved at the moment by the one I'm marking. Which means the language you use. Make it easy for them to engage with your work and your ideas. Don't get lost trying to be really complicated. It's not about being tricky. It's about articulating ideas in an informed and critical manner. And get into that practice as early as possible. Writing, from when you write your confirmation document, you could start. Keep it simple and clear. Don't decorate a submission with additional and not necessary content. Sometimes people feel like they have to pad it out. No padding required. Deep, clear thinking, insights, critical, experimental, but no garnishes. With multiple components, provide a clear wayfinding system. Tell me in the introduction what the components of the submission are and how they work with each other. You know, and it's the same way that you would do in your practice. So keep it really clear, and aesthetics matter. Right? The form, the language, the experience of engaging with your work should be part of your argument, part of your discovery. You're doing creative practice research, so therefore you should be using your capacity to engage, inform, be critical, be brutal, whatever it is, but be consistent so that is part of what the examiner will know. My own PhD was on labyrinths, and I took a fairly tricky, dangerous move in that my text was quite labyrinthine. But it was deliberately took you on the very argument I was making in the way you move through the chapters. But it was a risky move, but one I wanted to take to help them understand what it was that I was talking about in what I was doing. So always with the my supervisors were uneasy, but you know, at the end of the day, it was mine. But do think about this. There's nothing that drives me more bananas is that when I'm reading a work about ephemeral concepts and it reads like the driest social science. I need the poetry in what I'm doing. And then ask yourself, these are the questions which I'm sure anybody who's done examinations knows. Ask yourself the question before your presentation. Ask yourself these, in fact, before you complete your submission. Could you know what you know now if you hadn't done the research project as a PhD? I have heard that in nearly every examination I have been to, articulated in one way or another. So why did you have to do a doctorate to do what you've done? Couldn't you have just done the paintings? Like, why have you done this? And how is doing the PhD or Masters, if that's what you're doing, transformed or impacted on your practice? And you need to be able to answer that and articulate that with ease, because that's the real nub of it. That's the practitioner transformed. That is the knowledge in practice. So to think about those ones. And remember, your examiners want you to pass. There's heaps of research to show that. They actually want you to pass. And they want to have a rigorous conversation with someone who has a keen interest in a topic just as they are. That might be even just what they're reading. Right? And we love getting excited by interesting and new ideas with our peers, which is what PhD students are. So that's my bit.